You're listening to episode 13 of Speakin with Deacon, Rich in Mercy.
Speakin with Deacon is a production of the Perusia Podcast Network in partnership with Voice of Charity Australia and EWTN Asia Pacific. Join us as we discuss strategies that will empower us to announce the gospel of the Lord daily through our words and deeds. This is Speakin with Deacon.
Hello and thanks for joining us once again for Speakin with Deacon. I'm Mark Griffin, and joining me once again, as he always does, Deacon Harold Burke-Sivers. Deacon Harold, how are you?
I'm doing well, Mark. Great to see you and great to be with you and all the members of the Perusia family.
Great to have you back on and great to have you as part of the Perusia family. It's always good to chat with you. And today we're going to be developing on a podcast we record, I think it was episode 8, on the Sacrament of Reconciliation. So today we're actually going to be not touching on reconciliation so much, but sort of delving further into the depths of God's merciful love as we look at a bit of a case study. And this case study will be that of your own testimony, Deacon, of your relationship with your father and the mercy of God in both of your lives. Before we get into that testimony and that story, why don't we just lay a bit of groundwork with a bit of terminology? Now, people will have heard, and a lot of people will know, the devotion to divine mercy. But can you just give us a brief explanation on what is meant by the term divine mercy and where St. Faustina fits into the picture?
Yeah, sure. So divine mercy, we see that term, well, not the term divine mercy, but rich in mercy, right? Mm-hmm. Which we see that in the Psalms. And was also John Paul II named one of his encyclical letters, Dives in Misericordiae, rich in mercy. So divine mercy is God the Father's merciful love. That's really the bottom line. It's God the Father's merciful love. It is God's loving response to overcoming evil and suffering. So divine mercy becomes visible in and through the person of Jesus Christ. By his words, his actions, his death and resurrection, we see a living witness and example of God's merciful love. And so we, in turn, are to become witnesses of mercy to others. In the way that God's merciful love has worked through us in Jesus, we are to become vehicles of mercy in the lives of others. So let me give you a concrete example. So those who seek and find mercy in Jesus are therefore experiencing God's own mercy and love. Okay. So how does that work with us? Jesus, we see, ate meals and hung out with people that were often ostracized by society, right? So tax collectors, prostitutes, people like us, or obviously we see the problem with prostitution, but tax collectors were collecting taxes for the Romans and taking part of that tax for themselves. So the Romans were the enemy. So these were Jews who were in, like Matthew, right? Was the tax the Apostle Matthew collected taxes and then gave those taxes to the enemy of the Jewish people, and then I'm not saying Matthew did this, but many of the tax collectors skim some of those. They collected extra tax. So they gave to the Romans their tax, and they kept some of it for themselves. So they were considered very dishonest. They were very much looked down by the entire Jewish community. And so, but these are the people, Gentiles also, non-Jews. These are people Jesus hung out with. These are people he ate with, he broke bread with, he spent time with. Now, by doing that, did Jesus endorse their behavior? Because he hung out with tax collectors and sinners, did Jesus say, you know what? I like the fact that you're skimming off the top. I like the fact that you're exploiting your own people. How about the prostitutes? How about the person caught in adultery? Yeah, you know what? Just keep doing what you're doing. You'll be fine. You know, it's your body, your choice. You know what? No, because he hung out with people like that did not mean that he endorsed their behavior. He was being a witness and example of God's merciful love, that even someone like you who may be rejected by society, God still loves you. You still have value. You still have worth. You are still created in the image and likeness of God. And see, and sometimes, I don't know how to say this. I even hate using the term, ultra conservative Catholics or something. I even hate using that term.
It's all labels.
But Catholics who think, wow, Deacon Harold, man, why is he hanging out with that person? Why is he talking with that person? That person's, same-sex attracted. That person has gender identity issues and stuff. Why is he talking to them? That's what Jesus would do, because I'm talking with them, because I'm sharing my faith and sharing my life experience. That doesn't mean I endorse what they're doing or encourage it at all, right? I'm just showing them that, yes, you have value. Yes, you have worth. When I was in law enforcement, Mark, if there was an assault against someone that was same-sex attracted or someone who had gender confusion or something, I would defend that person. You see what I'm saying? How about this? On the plane, not too long ago, there was a guy sitting next to me and a guy across the aisle from me. And he asked me if he could switch seats so he could sit next to his husband. Okay. Now, what I said, I'm not going to do that because marriage is between a man and a woman, and what you guys doing is immoral. And yeah, that's true. But what did I do? I got up and I switched seats with the guy. Now, by doing that, I was wearing my crucifix, right? I was wearing my, so does that mean like I endorse what that lifestyle choice decision? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But that doesn't mean I have to be a jerk. I can still be nice, right? Yeah. And if they were to, this didn't happen, but if they were to continue to have a conversation with me, I would gladly share my faith in Jesus Christ with them, gladly share why God ordained man and woman in marriage. I would gladly share my faith with them. You see what I'm saying? So what we want to try to do is create opportunities for God's love and the God's mercy to flow from us into the person that we encounter. And that's what Jesus did. And that's what we need to do.
Where did the popular devotion of Divine Mercy through St. Faustina come from? And how does that play out in our lives now? So this is the other aspect of it, the actual devotion that we've come to know.
So St. Faustina was a Polish sister, Polish nun, who received private revelations from Jesus. Jesus visited her, and he gave her messages of love and mercy, which she wrote down and recorded in her famous book, of course, on divine mercy. Now, for many, many years, her writings were banned by the church. Okay? Wait a minute. Who's this nun? She's having what? Jesus is visiting her? He's giving her these messages about what? Divine mercy? What is divine mercy? I mean, that was really nothing that was really a thing in the church, right? Divine mercy, what is that? It wasn't until John Paul II, who was the Pope of Mercy, right, as he's called. He was the one who really saw that there was nothing wrong with anything that, and yes, it's private revelation. We're not required to believe it, but there was nothing in it that was against the teachings of the church. And just like, Lourdes and Fatima and Guadalupe, those are all revelations of Mary, right? And again, we're not required to believe those, right? But the church says yes, this did actually happen. And the same thing with Saint Faustina visiting Jesus visiting Saint Faustina. So those messages that were given to this amazing saint were written down, and John Paul II was the one who authorized this devotion to be carried forward. The publication of her materials, of her diary, and then of the devotions that came forth from that diary and from the revelations of Jesus Christ to Faustina. And that's where we get the Chaplet of Divine Mercy and all the beautiful Divine Mercy devotions. Really, John Paul II, who really made that come alive during his pontificate.
I actually brought this with me for those watching the video. That's the image of Divine Mercy that Saint Faustina commissioned to be painted. So that was under instruction as well. She was instructed to do that, or is that something that?
Yes, she was instructed by the Lord to do that. And so the first couple pictures. In fact, I got a chance to go to Poland last year and actually visit the monastery that St. Faustine was in, and it got a chance to see the first version of that photo. Of the first version of that painting. It wasn't quite right. So people said, no, that's not quite right. And so they had to retweak it. So you can see the different versions of it when you go there. It was amazing to be and to pray the Chapel of Divine Mercy in the Church of Divine Mercy where her body is. Because her body's is the tomb is inside the church. I mean, it was incredible. And I love the Divine Mercy devotion. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And I hope after this podcast that many other people have a strong devotion when they hear practically how God's mercy works in very difficult situations.
Absolutely. Now, our Lord from the cross gave us his mother to be our mother as well. How can we find our Lord's mercy through Our Lady? And then maybe this can lead into your own testimony, because I know that Our Lady plays a role a little bit in your testimony. So let's start from there. And how can we find our Lord's mercy through Our Lady?
Yeah, the thing about Mary, right? Everything that Mary does points us and leads us to Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. Her last words in Scripture at the wedding feast of Cana, do whatever he tells you. Right. So that's her whole mission now. For us, when she appears, she always wants to bring people into deeper love and intimacy of her son. So of course, and look, moms, I mean, you hear soldiers in battle when they're hurt, who they cry out for their mothers. Right. I remember once I was in South Africa. And for some reason, I don't know if it was the traveling or low salt content, I got these incredibly painful cramps, like in my legs and in my arms. It's like, it was just one of the most painful things I ever experienced. I just cried out to my mom, who was deceased, right? I just cried out, Mom, and soon the pain went away, So I don't know if my mother interceded for me or what, but we all, when we want love, we want that kind of tender, merciful love. We always go to our mothers, right? A mother's hug is so different from a father's hug, right? I mean, they're both beautiful, but when you got that mother's hug, you just feel that with a father's hug, you feel strong, you feel secure, right? You feel like, yes, you feel confident. And with a mom, you feel that emotional kind of connection. You feel that deeper intimacy, and that's like the merciful love that the Blessed Virgin Mary exudes because remember, we're brothers and sisters of Christ. That means that spiritually, Mary's our mother as well. Right? So Mary wants to share that love and mercy with all of us. At the foot of the cross, she was there. I mean, Christ's blood probably dripped on her. So she was a witness of the power of God's merciful love at the foot of the cross. And so when we're at the cross in our lives, right? And what did Jesus do? He looked down and he saw his mother. And there's something that, of course, is not recorded in the scriptures, but there's something in me that says, I think Jesus took solace in the fact that his mother was there. It was extremely painful for him to watch her suffer, knowing that she was going through intense pain. But if you look in Psalm 22, right, there's something, Psalm 22 to me is amazing. It's a messianic psalm of fulfillment. And this is the one that Jesus prayed from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And, it also says they tear holes in my hands and my feet and lay me in the dust of death. I can count every one of my bones. These people stare at me and gloat. They threw dice for my clothes, right? That was 700 years before Jesus was even born. So Psalm 22 talks about, but look what it says. Look what it says here in verse 10. Yes, it was you who took me from the womb, entrusted me to my mother's breast. To you I was committed from birth. From my mother's womb, you have been my God. Now, Jesus praying this psalm on the cross, right? Scripture records that clearly. And imagine when he got to this part, he's looking down and seeing his mother. You see? So Mary is a beautiful witness and example for us of how we can be examples of God's love and mercy in the lives of others. She was there to endure that pain and suffering, but yet she is comfort and solace to all of her other sons and daughters, which are all of us. So she could be a beautiful example of God's mercy.
And she also, even at the wedding feast at Cana, and she went to Jesus and she said, "Son, they have no wine." And he said, "Woman, what is this between you and me?" It's not that he was refusing her intercession on behalf of the wedding party here, trying to help them out. She took their need to him. More like he was like, are you sure you're ready for me to do this? This is going to mean that I now start my public ministry if I do this. And he was sort of just running it by her once more. Are you sure that's what you want me to do? And then, you know, she must have had this little smirk on her face when she said, "Do whatever he tells you." She knew what was going to happen. But he did what she requested of him. And we can have that same trust that whatever she requests of Jesus on our behalf, he will do what's best for us. And if that request is what's best for us, he will do that. So,
yeah, absolutely. And remember when he says woman there, right? I mean, it's not disrespectful. Yeah. Woman, because you would never call your mother woman, right? But I think what was happening was that Mary asked him to do something supernatural. So he was referring to her by her supernatural name, woman, in Revelation chapter 12, right? The woman with the crown of 12 stars around her head, the moon under her feet, clothed with the clothed with the sun. That woman, right? The woman of Revelation is our Blessed Mother, right? And I think Jesus called her woman because he referred to her by her supernatural name. Right. The same woman from Genesis chapter 3:15 that would crush the head of Satan. Right. So that's the spiritual sense in which he's, so he's not dissing her. He's not questioning, why'd you ask me that? That's not it at all. I think you're right. I think he was asked her to do something of a supernatural nature, and he was just double checking. You sure you want me to do this? Like you said, it's beautiful.
He was acknowledging her role in all of this by calling her by her supernatural name, whilst she was acknowledging his role is now about to really ramp up. He's taking the next step into public ministry. Yeah, so it's a beautiful passage, that one, the wedding feast at Cana. As I was saying, I've heard you give your testimony about your relationship with your father and the mercy that God's shown on the both of you through that relationship and the struggles you've been through, and Our Lady played a part. So why don't we jump in to a bit of this testimony now? Why don't you give us a bit of a background and where this all starts? Give us a bit of a background on your father and then your relationship with him.
Yeah, so I'll do the short version, right? Because I have entire talk where I go in this into much more detail. But so we're from my family's from Barbados, which is an island in the West Indies, in the lower West Indies, in a chain of islands called the Lesser Antilles, which is not too far off the coast of Venezuela in South America. Okay. So that's where I was born. My father was a very successful singer, songwriter, and musical performer. Very talented singer and guitar player. He owned 2 very successful nightclubs. He also had some hit songs. And he was a performing musician his entire life. And so my mother was a nurse, and my mother did not like the lifestyle that my father was living, although, we were doing well financially. But, when he lived like a very successful musician. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. All the things you hear about musicians. Yeah, that was my dad. Okay. So my mom left Barbados without my dad and came to the United States. And then eventually my dad did join us. But we quickly learned that my dad loved 3 things: womenizing, alcohol, and cigarettes, right? So my father has 15 other children from affairs with other women that happened before, during, and after his marriage to my mom. My father never went to church. He was not baptized. The only time the first time I ever saw my father in church was in 2009. That's the first time I ever saw my father in church. But growing up, never went to church. The only time I ever heard him use God's name was as a curse. And he drank, and if you've ever been in a household where alcohol is an issue, there's some very hurtful, very painful, some very embarrassing things that happen when you live in a house like that. And and my parents eventually got divorced, and everything was fine with my dad until I joined the Benedictines. And when I was accepted into the monastic community, I went to share the news with my dad, and he was very angry. And that incident, when I went to see him, is what really severed our relationship for 18 years. I left his apartment and I didn't speak to him for the next 18 years. I consider him dead to me at that point. In fact, I was so angry and so bitter that I told my kids he was dead. So when my older kids started going to school, they had grandparents' day at school. And so when they asked me about where's our grandfather, I told them he was dead. And that's how much I hated my father. So fast forward now, my first series starts to appear on EWTN, which is Behold the Man, right? The series for men. It starts to air internationally. Someone from my home country, Barbados, sees me on television, informs my father. Now, my father doesn't go to church, and obviously doesn't watch EWTN or anything like that. But someone called him, heard it was me, so he flips on the channel. He catches the last 10 minutes of the program. So he wants to watch again the next week, but he got the time wrong. And so instead of watching me, he's watching Mother Angelica. Right? So my father, remember, was a musician. He didn't know how this worked. He said, "Who's this lady? Where's my son?" And he thought, oh, she must be the opening act, right? She's going to come out and talk for a while, and then my son's going to come out, And so when I never made an appearance, but my father continued to watch the entire episode of Mother Angelica.
Wow.
And I didn't know any of this. So fast forward a year later, my father calls me out of the blue. I had not talked to him for 18 years. He calls me out of the blue and tells me about his relationship with Jesus. And I hung up the phone. I said, this man's a liar. He spent his whole life lying to us. And now all of a sudden, I was just supposed to believe he found Jesus. He doesn't know Jesus. I know Jesus, right? I'm the one in EWTN. All that man knows how to do is destroy our family, right? So in God's providence, I was asked to speak in my home state of New Jersey, which was the first time I ever spoke as a deacon in my home state. I went back, and the parish that I spoke at was about a mile or a little less than a kilometer or a little more than a kilometer from my father's apartment. And so I took that as a sign. And so I met with my dad, and I didn't recognize him at first because he had cancer and he had lost a ton of weight, a lot of body weight. And, and so I was a little shocked as parent. And then I wanted to hear, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry, son, for the hell I put you and your mother and your siblings through for all those years. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your graduation from high school because I was drunk. I'm sorry I couldn't come to see you participate in sports in high school because I was too busy sleeping around with other women, right? I wanted to hear, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. But all he did was kept talking about what his life was like now after he encountered Christ. And so I came back home, and my mother was living with us at the time. And she says, "Is it true, son? Is it true?" And I said, "Mommy, you can't fake what I saw," And so fast forward about a year later, my father wants to come and visit us in Oregon. He's never met my wife or kids before. And so I knew I had a problem because I told the kids he was dead. Right. So, I went to my wife and I said, "How do I get out of this?" And she goes, "Well, Jesus did raise the dead, didn't he?" Right. And so I said, "Oh, okay." So I gathered the kids around. Guess what? It's a miracle. You're going to meet your grandfather. And obviously when they're that young, you can get away with that. Right. So my father came out, he met my family. We had an amazing weekend. He met Father Donald Calloway, which was an amazing experience for my dad to hear Father Calloway's conversion story from Father Calloway himself and be present in the room. It was a powerful experience for my dad. Like, wait a minute. If a guy like that could become a priest, it gave my father hope, And he also reconciled with my mom that weekend too. My mother was living with us, but during the time that my dad was there, my mom had a bout of congestive heart failure. So she was living in a assisted care community facility, and so I brought my father there, and I was not in the room when they talked, but I don't know what they talked about. I have to this very day I have no idea what they talked about, but I do know that they reconciled that night because my mom would later tell me that that's what happened, that they reconciled. You know, they never got back together or anything like that, you know, after the divorce, but that was an answer to prayer for my mother. You know, that was truly, like, literally an answer to prayer for my mom to reconcile my dad before she died. So God allowed that amazing grace to happen. And so when I talked to my dad about what happened, how did he go from, well, I don't know if he would say it like this, but hating God, at least that's what I thought, to all of a sudden, like, being in fire. He goes, yeah. So he said it was the Blessed Mother and Divine Mercy. So this was a man who destroyed our family through drinking and through using women. And now he said what led to his change, it's a massive change, massive conversion, was the Blessed Mother and Divine Mercy. He's not even baptized. How did he even know what those things were? Through EWTN, right? Through first Mother Angelica. Well, first watching my series and Mother Angelica, and then he kept watching EWTN. And he came to understand the power of God's love, you know, but that's just one level, right? He needed to experience God's love and mercy at a whole different level. And that came through Mark, reconciliation, right? And those are the difficult steps that we all have to make, because we've all, have dealt with someone that hurt us, right? The memories of the hurts that have happened to us in the past still haunt many of us to this day. We're still oppressed by the feelings and the emotions of that event that happened to us. And the fact is, you know, we can't find the peace that God wants to give us, right? Jesus says in John chapter 14, peace I leave you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives, do I give it to you. But the thing is, we can never find that peace unless we first open our hearts to receive God's divine mercy into our own lives, so we become vehicles of mercy to others. And so we have, you know, there might be abuse of a husband or wife, spousal abuse, infidelity, alcohol and drugs, you know, rape, bullying, suicide attempt, being estranged from your children who are not practicing their faith, anger, depression. There are all kinds of things that hold us back from really receiving the depth of God's love and mercy, not because God doesn't want to give it to us, but we're so filled with things that are separate, that God's love, he's not going to force us to love him. We have to open our hearts to receive. And so the steps that I want to do next, Mark, is just kind of walk people through the steps that I did in my own life to reconcile with my dad and to really find a very deep level of healing in God's mercy.
Can I just add one thing in here before you go on to that?
Sure.
At this point, you had obviously written your father off as a hopeless case, told the kids he was dead. So whilst he needed healing and forgiveness for his life, at this point, you're in a state now where you started playing God. You're hopeless. You're nothing to me. You're dead. And that's not a role that we can play in our lives. And so this has to go both ways now, doesn't it? This reconciliation isn't just one apologizing to the other. This is going to have to go both ways. So as we go through, I think we need to make sure that this is now a two-way issue that needs to be nutted out, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You know, and people think, wait a minute, you're Deacon Harold, and you, but I'm still a human being. You know, I still have feelings and emotion, and especially, you know, when you're young, and you know you're witnessing things between your parents, and you're experiencing things, you know, your dad not being there, and you know, it does something to you. You know, it does something to you. It does it. Absolutely, it's a wound, and even though I was ordained and become Deacon Harold, that wound was still there. That healing had not come. So I was being a vehicle of mercy in the lives of other people that would come to me for marriage counseling, or they're having issues with pornography, or whatever the issue is. I was there, but I was not there for my dad. And it took, and I think, God had me make that series for men, that television series, for my dad. That was really what opened the door to mercy. So it's me, in a sense, being a vehicle of mercy to my dad, which would unfold in a much deeper way as we go through these 4 steps.
Yeah, and as we lead into that, if you think about the line from the prayer, the Our Father, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And then also in Matthew, I think it's chapter 18, hang on, I've got to know. Yeah, chapter 18. I was going to mention this before, but this sort of fits in here well now. Peter asked Jesus how many times we must forgive, and the back and forth, and it ends up 70 times 7. And then he goes on to tell the story of the unforgiving servant, who his master, he owed an amount to his master, and he was forgiven that debt. But then he turned around and one of his servants owed to him, and he wouldn't forgive that debt. And so this is an example of, even though we have someone who's owing something to us, just remember, we owe to others and they can show mercy to us. We have to then turn around and show that mercy as well. It's not something we can take and just hang on to. We have to take and then share. And so as we go through this next part, I suppose we're going to demonstrate those 2 particular examples through the next phase.
Yeah.
So we've identified that your father's found the Lord. You're having a hard time actually accepting that he's found it, but you're acknowledging, look, you can't fake this. So how did you begin this process of forgiveness between each other and reconciliation there?
Now, I think the verses you point out actually lead very well into this, Mark, because, forgive us our trespasses, we forgive those who trespass against us, means that God will only forgive us to the extent that we're willing to forgive others. Mm-hmm. We often don't stop to think about that. We pray the Our Father so fast, and we're often not thinking about it, what we're saying. But if we stop and really reflect on what God is saying to us, that he will only forgive us to the extent that we are willing to forgive others. And again, Jesus models this powerful witness of God's mercy on the cross. He was forgiving the people that were killing him. Imagine someone's torturing you and you're forgiving them as they're torturing you, right? And look at St. Stephen, right? The deacon and the proto-martyr, the first martyr in the church in Acts of the Apostles, stoned to death, asking God to forgive them for what they were doing. That's hard, but that's exactly what God is asking us to do. And then 70 times 7, it didn't mean 490 times, by the way. It wasn't like an actual mathematical formula. Jesus was using a rabbinical teaching technique called hyperbole. That's when you exaggerate a point in order to make a point. So he goes, as many as 7 times, right? Because, in fact, Peter thought he was pushing the envelope there, because the Jewish practice was to forgive 3 times, right? Because if you look in the Old Testament, it says that you forgive as many times as God forgives. And what does it say in the Old Testament? God, you are to forgive and forgive and forgive. 3 times. 3 times. So that's why when Peter said, as many as 7 times, he was like, okay, 3 times is what the Bible, even more than that. And Jesus says 70 times. In other words, an infinite amount you are to forgive. Woo! But again, that's really hard. Why? Because we're enslaved to the emotions and the feelings and the anger that's associated with a hurt. And sometimes a serious hurt from the past. When someone has hurt us, we're resentful, we're angry, we're bitter, and and especially if there's no reconciliation, it's very hard to get past that. So the 4 phases, and these things I'm going to mention here are very difficult. Okay. But in a sense, spiritually, these are kind of the last 4 steps that Jesus took before he mounted the cross. right? So these are the steps of the final steps of divine mercy. So one of them, the first one, is to be aware and to acknowledge that something has happened to you from the past. The worst thing that we could ever do is to push down and oppress a memory of what happened, or the feeling. If I don't think about it, did it never really happened? No. One thing we can't do is fool ourselves. We have to acknowledge that pain. Why? Because we're giving, by feeling and experiencing that pain and that hurt, we're allowing God's mercy and healing to come in and to bring peace to us. But we have to bring it up. We have to let it come to the surface. And so if you have to cry, then cry. If you have to scream, then scream. But don't push it down, because it could come back to bite you. It can come back. And in the longer talk, I tell the story of a man that this happened to, who was not a parishioner. He came to the parish upset because he said his wife was kicking him out of the house. And what happened was his wife had suppressed a memory of an abuse that happened to her. And when she came home from work and saw the father playing with the daughter, just innocently playing with his daughter, she transferred the abuse that happened to her onto her husband. See? Mm-hmm. And so, and it's a very sad and tragic thing. I mean, he went to court, he got custody taken away, and if you just would have saw the raw emotion of this man, he clearly did what he was accused of by his wife. But I did confirm with her parents that she was actually abused and they didn't deal with it. So now it came up later in her, because he said up until that time, he said they had a normal conjugal intimacy. They had no problems with their other child. It was just this one incident that brought up a memory that she transferred. And so we can't do it. If something happened to us, we have to acknowledge it. We have to, even if we don't share it, we just have to bring it up and acknowledge it. If we have to scream or cry, whatever we have to do, that's really important. So God can begin the process of healing is by being honest. That's like a sacrament confession. If you knowingly have a sin that you are to confess it, you don't confess it, you're not forgiven. People realize that. Now, if you honestly, you walk out of confession, I forgot that one. Oh, man, that's an honest mistake. And we're all human beings. We all make mistakes. But if you know there's a sin you want to, but I don't want to say it. Then you're not forgiven. One of the key things to the forgiveness of sin is the acknowledgement of the sin. We see this in John, the first letter of John, chapter 1, right around verse 19 or so, that says that we have to confess our sin in order for the sin to be forgiven. In Leviticus chapter 5, it says we have to confess the sin that we have committed. And so in a similar way, if we want God's divine mercy to work in our lives, we have to acknowledge what happened to us, the hurt that happened to us in the past.
So that's number one, is to acknowledge that there was something there that has to be addressed. So that's number one. Moving on, what's number two in this process?
So number two, we have to not be afraid to face the Goliath in our life. And in the longer talk, I go through the kind of story of David and Goliath. And just very quickly, all of Israel were afraid of Goliath. Why? Because you look at him, he was, 2.97 meters tall, right? He weighed, how much would that be in kilos? Like 150 kilos or something. He was a huge dude. And everybody was afraid of him except for David. Now, why did David confront Goliath? Because first of all, Goliath was mocking the armies of God, right? So he's in a sense mocking God and mocking God's works. And so David took offense to that and wanted to fight Goliath. And so what did he go armed with? He tried to put on Saul's armor, and that didn't work. And David said, I can't go out with these. I'm not used to them. So he went with him with a 5 smooth stones from the brook and a sling. And he moved toward Goliath. So a sling and 5 smooth stones, right? A sling and 5 smooth stones. So I think if you look at biblical typology, in other words, how things in the Old Testament foreshadow and look forward to things in the New Testament, I think that David fought Goliath with a type of rosary, a spiritual weapon. So the 5 stones represent the 5 wounds of Christ, or each of the 5 joyful, sorrowful, luminous, and glorious mysteries of the rosary. So, and when he goes to confront Goliath laughs at him. He goes, "You think you can beat me? I'm Goliath." And what about when we confront the Goliaths in our lives with the weapons of God, right? With the praying the chaplet of divine mercy, with the rosary, with Eucharistic adoration, with novenas, right? With all the different things that we have, the arsenal that we have in the church to confront our Goliath. Goliath will not be able to stand. He's going to try to push back. You think you can defeat me with your rosaries and your chaplets and your prayers and your adoration? I'm Goliath. I'm the person who abused you. I'm the one who stole money from you. I'm the one who said some bad things for you at work, and you didn't get the promotion. I got it because I stepped on you in order to get it. I'm the one who caused your kid to leave the church. We're so afraid of that God. We don't want to face that challenge, but that's what David did, because he realized that God fights with and for him, that God is with him. What does he say? He goes, "You come to me with sword and javelin and spear. I come to you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel." In Hebrew, he goes, "I come to you, Yahweh Sabaoth," right? The God of armies, right? So what do we say at every Mass? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Right? So we say the same thing at every Mass that David says to Goliath. So we should not be afraid to face that Goliath, because just like David, we know that God is with us, and God is fighting with us and for us by our side in the sacraments and in the life of the church.
I love that image of those 5 smooth stones and the rosary as spiritual weapons. I just think that's a really powerful thing for people to hang on to, that we have similar capability. We're fighting for the Lord here. We have the spiritual weapons at our disposal. We just have to see it. So step 1, acknowledge that there's an issue. Step 2, face our Goliath. Step 3.
Yep, with the weapons of God, exactly. And then step 3 is and step 3 is general confession. Okay. Now, how is this different from regular confession? General confession is when you go into the confessional and you confess all of the sins you committed in your entire life. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, why would I want to do that? Because the sin is already forgiven. And that's true. So why would you confess it again if it's already been forgiven? Very simply this. Who is often the hardest person to forgive? Mark, who's often the hardest person to forgive?
Myself.
Yourself. You're right. Yeah. When you do something wrong, or something or something is even done to you, the hardest person to forgive is yourself. So by going to that confession, confessing all your sins, you'll realize, like the prodigal son did, when he realized and acknowledged his sin, he started making his way back to the Father, right? And the best part of that parable, when he was still a long way off, the Father caught sight of him, and the Father ran toward his son. So when the son made that effort to go back to the Father, it's like us entering into that confession with general confession. You confess, okay, I confess this sin. And you realize, wait a minute, I don't do that sin nearly as much anymore. And now you're closer to God than where you thought. Then you realize, wait a minute, that sin, I don't do that sin nearly as much as I used to. And you're even closer now, right? And the beautiful thing is when you start acknowledging God in that way and recognizing that, wait a minute, your journey to God, you're actually closer than when you thought, God will rush to meet you with his grace, with his love, and with his divine mercy.
How is a general confession then different from just a simple examination of conscience, where you can develop these, look at this track that I've been taking and I'm getting better? You can do that in an examination of conscience, So how is that different to a general confession? And then what sort of grace is imparted on you in a general confession as opposed to a normal number and kind confession that you might do on a somewhat frequent basis?
Yeah. So the thing about the general confession is this. You could do that in examination of conscience, but when you're actually saying the words, right? It's coming out of your mouth. You hear yourself saying it. You're acknowledging it before the priest, who's actually of Jesus, right? Jesus forgiving his sin through the priest, through the power and authority he received from Jesus Christ himself in John chapter 20. So it's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to acknowledge it. And it's the power of the forgiveness comes when you acknowledge that sin, when you recognize, wait a minute, you come to that moment of catharsis where you realize that, wait a minute, I slowly but surely over even a period of years, I have, as I matured, spiritually, as I've matured as a person, I have been cooperating more fully with the grace that I received in the sacrament. I have been able to overcome some adversity. But we get so caught up in all these things in life, we don't put it all together. So the general confession is a way to bring that all together and come to the realization that, wait a minute, yes, I'm still a work in progress. We are all a work in progress till we actually get to heaven, right? We're a work, but guess what? I'm actually in a better place, in a different space than where I thought I was when I started my journey with God. You see? And so the grace that you receive in general confession is not any different than the grace that you receive in a regular number and kind confession. But if the priest is doing his job, he'll allow you to see that, okay, now that you've been doing this your whole life, don't forget the other part, the Father's going to rush to meet you with his grace. So be ready for that, because God is always looking for opportunities to come into our lives and to transform us. And by acknowledging, that general confession, we're creating more space in our hearts to receive even a deeper reception of God's merciful love in our lives.
So what you're saying is that in a situation where if we did something similar in an examination of conscience, we might still be tussling in our mind with, oh, have I really done that? Am I really that bad? But it's sort of a tussle. But as soon as it's spoken, it can't be unspoken. It's said, you've acknowledged it.
Yes.
It's on the table now. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
But,
yeah. See, Mark, it's the same thing, Mark. It's the same thing, Mark. Like if it's one thing, I'm going to talk to my wife about this. Okay. It's another thing about running it in your head, what that conversation is going to be like. It's another thing when you actually sit down and talk. Right. Because often what's in your head is not actually what comes. You see what I'm saying? So that's the power of the general confession, because it's also you're humbling yourself and allowing the Lord to work through you in that moment as well.
Now, obviously, that's going to take a lot longer than a normal confession. So that wouldn't be one that you sit in front of a queue of 40 people and go in for a general confession. That's one that you make an appointment for at a separate time.
Correct. Or if it's a reconciliation service where there's 3-4 priests there at a reconciliation service, that'd be okay to do it during something like that as well. But again, don't wait for Advent or Lent for a reconciliation service. Like you said, Mark, make an appointment, and to see the priest, and the priest will be happy to hear your confession.
So that's step 3, make a general confession as opposed to your normal confession. So what's now step 4 in this 4-step process?
So this one's the hardest one out of all of them. Asking the person that hurt you for forgiveness for how you felt toward them. So let me be very clear. You're not asking the person for forgiveness for what they did to you. You're asking the person who hurt you for forgiveness for how you felt about them. So let me give you an example from my dad. When this moment happened with my father, I was back in New Jersey. This was several years later now. And my father was sitting on the couch, and I felt called by the Holy Spirit to kneel down at my father's feet. And I asked him to forgive me for hating him for 18 years. I asked my father to forgive me for telling his grandchildren that he was dead. You see? Now, you're saying, why would you do that? He was the one that, you didn't do anything wrong. He was the one. That's not the point. That's not the point. And that beautiful divine mercy image that you held up earlier, Mark, that was manifested to Saint Faustina. You see, the rays are coming out from the heart of Jesus, right? You see the picture there. The rays are coming out from the heart of Jesus and radiating into the world, right? So when we're asking forgiveness for the person, we're being that vehicle of divine mercy in the life of that other person. See, so by asking them for forgiveness for how we felt toward them, we're actually allowing God's divine mercy to work in that other person's life, and then they become a vehicle of mercy to us. It's beautiful. So what happened was, when I said that to my dad, he was a little bit caught off guard, because you would expect to hear, I'm waiting to hear forgiveness from him, but he did not expect to hear, Pop, I'm sorry for hating you for those years, not reaching out to you. I'm sorry for telling your grandkids that you were dead and depriving you of fortunately they were still small at the time, but depriving you of those first years of their lives. I mean, that's really hard, Mark. Think about it. Think if you were sexually abused when you were a kid, going to the abuser and telling that person, I forgive you for how you felt, for the hatred I had toward you. Whoa. Or to a spouse who beat you, right? Or to the kid who bullied you in school, who used to make fun of you because you wore glasses or braces, or because makes you racial jokes, or you were a different race, or you had a different accent. And you're asking that person for forgiveness for how you felt toward them. Mm-hmm. My father was in tears, actually. And what happened was he became a vehicle of mercy to me.
Sorry, did he actually know that you'd told your children that he was dead? Or is this something that was news to him as you apologized for it?
No, I told him that when earlier that when I picked him up from the airport, when he came to my house for the first time, I told him then that I told him the kids were dead. Kind of like, hey, Pop, I kind of told the kids you were dead, ha ha ha, kind of thing, Yeah. But here, a couple years later, I actually meant it in a much deeper, a much more real way here.
I can just imagine that this stage where you are apologizing to someone for how you felt, that could be confronting for them as well, because they might not have ever known the extent of your hurt, the extent of your anger, the extent of whatever. So that could be quite a revealing moment for them. So yeah, it would also be confronting for them. So you really are just opening the whole situation up at that point, just to allow everything to be aired and worked through at that point, aren't you?
Now let me make an important point here. By doing that, I'm not saying that I accept what happened. I'm not saying that I liked the situation, the divorce, that I still remember things that happened in our house, but I'm no longer a slave to those memories, right? Mm-hmm. What I've learned from that experience, Mark, is that the things of the past help shape me and help shape all of us into the people that we are today. But your past does not determine or control your future. A deep, intimate relationship with Jesus Christ is what determines your future. Here's why that's the first thing. And here's the second thing, why those 4 steps are so important, especially that last one. Think about it like this, Mark. You walk into your kitchen, because you have young kids, right, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got 8.
Do you have you have 8? So do you have is one of them like 3 or something like? Or do you have a son or a daughter?
There's 2 or 3. There's one who's 2, nearly 3. Yes.
Okay. So say you walk into your kitchen, Mark, and that child is holding a very large, very sharp knife by the blade in their hand, and you walk into the kitchen, you see them holding it. Would you go up to that child? Wait, what are you doing? And would you just snatch that knife out of their hand?
You'd cut them with it.
No,
Yeah.
Of course you cut them, right? What would you do instead? Oh, honey, what have you got there? What have you got there? Can you show Daddy what that is? And they walk over to you and they show you the knife. Look at that. wow, that is really sharp. Hey, honey, can you open your hand and give that to me? Oh, can you open your hand? Can you show that? Can you open? And then, you know what the child will do? They look at you and they open your hand really slow and you reach in. Oh, thank you, honey. Oh, I love you. Thank you so much. And you just slowly reach in and take the danger away, take the hurt away, right? Mm-hmm. That's what God wants to do for each and every one of us in our lives, Mark. God, these 4 steps, God is saying, what have you got there? What have you got? Oh, that's the anger and the hatred and the resentment and the pain and the anguish and the emotion and the hurt and the tears that you've held on to for all those years. God wants to say, what have you got there? Let me see. I love you. Let me take that from you. Let me reach into your heart, to reach into your soul with my incredible divine mercy. And let me once and for all take that out of your life. That's why those 4 steps are important, especially that last one, right? Mm-hmm. Forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. Nothing sinful and unclean can enter heaven. Book of Revelation is very clear about that, not including anger or hatred or resentment. So the more that we work to rid ourselves of that in this life, the more prepared we'll be for heaven. And it's God's incredible divine mercy that prepares us by being a vehicle of mercy in the lives of others. So they, in turn, sometimes can even be vehicles of mercy to us as well.
That's a beautiful image that you paint about just the father caring for the child. And our 2-year-old is definitely the one that we needed to use as the example, because she is definitely the one who I would find most likely in that situation as well. but no, and I think that imagery of the father and the child really ties together this whole discussion from today. It is mercy coming from the perspective of care. It's not just, all right, I'll forgive you this once. You've done the wrong thing, but I'll let you go this time. Thank you for your apology. Now let's move forward. It's more than that. It's such a deep and intentional love and care of the father for his child that really underlies this whole concept of God's mercy. So, I just think that's a beautiful way to actually summarize everything we've spoken about today, is just using that image. I really want to thank you, Deacon, for being so honest and so open in your testimony with your father. I think there's something in there for everybody, because within our own personal relationships with family and friends, you always have various different disagreements or situations that arise. And it's just really powerful. I really genuinely think that one of the most powerful tools we have for sharing the faith is testimony, because you're actually seeing this faith practically lived out in people's lives through the ups and the downs. And so thank you for today and for being so open and honest with your testimony and
thank you.
Eternal rest. I just want to share your father as well.
Yes, thank you. He died in 2016. And, I did get permission from him, though, to share this testimony. So I did ask him once, I said, hey, Pop, at some point, God may ask me to share, your story with people. Is it okay if I do that? And should I leave anything out? Right. And he was very gracious. He said, son, if you think my story will help people, you just tell them whatever you want, So tell me, in other words, tell them as much as of the story, the truth that you want. So, yeah.
Very, very powerful. Testimony is such a powerful tool. So thank you very much. That's about all the time we have for today. If anyone wants to hear more from Deacon Harold, he has presented over his years various different talks on various different topics, and we've made those available on this USB device. At the moment, there's 22 talks on that across the various topics. You can get that by visiting the deaconharold.com store page or the perusiamedia.com store page, depending where you are around the world, and you can get your hands on one of those. It's audio talks you can plug and play, ready to go. And there's also on that device, I think there's about 10 or 12 gig of free space after the talks. We intentionally gave you a device that you didn't only have the content, but it was something practical that you could then go and store your files. So something that you would regularly be using in addition to this fantastic content that's on there. So it's something that you can put on your keyring. I'll actually show you this one. It's actually designed to be a key ring. You can just put it on your keys. It's something you can take with you and use whilst having all this wonderful information there at your fingertips. So I very highly encourage you to get one of those. And also, while you're at both of those websites, look up all the resources from Deacon Harold. There's a wealth of information out there. And if you wanted to keep track of where Deacon's speaking, any of his upcoming events, or all other things in Deacon Harold world, you go to deaconharold.com to find all that information. And if also you wanted to see what we're doing at Parousia, visit parousiamedia.com to keep up to date. You can even click on the link to be added to our mailing list. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you once again, Deacon Harold, for your time, for your wisdom, and for your testimony.
You are most welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for listening. This has been Speaking with Deacon. We look forward to having you listen to us on the next edition. God bless you.